On to a question now. Does Israel still have America's unwavering support? Is Israel still America's closest ally in the region? These questions come up as a ground invasion of Gaza looms. We hear that Biden's quote-unquote unwavering support for Netanyahu is facing private strains. The U.S. Israel alignment may be strong out there in public, but it seems to be fraying behind the scenes. Let's tell you what we know so far. But first, consider this. EU states have called on a pause to the fighting between Hamas and Israel, a humanitarian pause, quote-unquote. The European Union leaders have issued this declaration. They want to establish a humanitarian corridor and get much-needed aid into the Gaza Strip. And amid the relentless fighting over the Palestinian enclave, remember, when it comes to the U.S., there is no such talk taking place in Washington. The U.S. has resisted calls for a ceasefire, in fact, at least at the moment. Right now, the U.S. is focused on supporting Israel's right to defend itself. And in this way, Europe and the U.S. differ when it comes to the ongoing Gaza war. And now that we have established that, let's move on to what the latest reports suggest. They say that there are concerns in private, not just over Israel's conduct of the war, but also its desire to press on quickly with a ground incursion into Gaza. You see, Joe Biden is worried for the hostages taken by Hamas. Remember, a handful of them are Americans. So the American president is clearly concerned what a full-scale invasion of Gaza might mean for the American hostages. And it's not just the American hostages that Hamas has, of course. Biden is also worried about the safety of his troops who are stationed in West Asia. He wants time so that they can prepare their defenses in case the war spreads, which is also something that Washington does not want. Remember, while Biden has pledged unconditional support for Israel, he has also warned against the expansion of the conflict. And there's another worry, this time within the Pentagon. They are worried that Israel's ground incursion has not had time to be properly considered. Gaza is steaming with Hamas tunnels. Israelis have little knowledge about them. After all, Israel was caught unaware by Hamas's attack on the 7th of October, and that intelligence failure casts doubts on Israel's wider preparedness for a war. Reports say that the American officials are asking Israel some tough questions about its military operations in Gaza and what their long-term goals really are. Although at the moment, Washington's own endgame remains undefined, Biden does not want to put U.S. boots on the ground, but that has not stopped him from boosting military presence in the region. Remember, the U.S. has sent advisors to help Israel plan the ground invasion. So despite Biden saying that he does not want to see the conflict spreading, developments on the ground suggest otherwise. Just take, for example, the clashes between Israel and Hamas's ally in Lebanon, the Hezbollah group. Also, let's not forget, American troops in the region have suffered targeted, albeit limited attacks that they blame on Iran-allied groups. So in a broader sense, Washington seems to want to salvage its plan in West Asia. For Biden, U.S. foreign policy largely focuses on China. Whatever time they devoted to West Asia was mostly about securing a reconciliation between Israel and Saudi Arabia. The U.S. was of the belief that if two of the biggest allies in the region could set aside their differences, they could work together against militant Islamism and the threat posed by Iran. And all these efforts were taken so that the U.S. does not have to act as a sheriff in the West Asian region. Well, those plans seem to have gone down the drain, at least for now. Why? Because the harsher the Israeli response in Gaza, the harder it will be to get the Gulf states back on the talking table. Remember, the entire Arab world, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, all those who have diplomatic relations with Israel, our U.S. allies in the region as well, have strongly condemned Israel's bombardment in Gaza. The war is raging on, but there are several questions that remain. Questions about the accountability for Israel's security failures. Questions about who should govern Gaza once Hamas has been wiped out. Questions about what a lasting peace in West Asia looks like. Questions about the long-suggested two-state solution. Both Biden and Netanyahu have their work cut out for what happens next. With the ground incursion looming, and a war that could set the entire region on fire. It seems that the differences, if any, between Biden and Netanyahu will have to be set aside. Netanyahu cannot afford to ignore what Biden tells him to do. With me on the broadcast this minute now is Dr. Hassan Al-Hassan. He is a research fellow for Middle East policy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, joining us from Bahrain. Thanks very much for being here. Let me begin by asking you for your assessment on the ground in Gaza right now.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for having me. The most important development in Gaza is the worsening humanitarian situation. So we've already got around 7,500 people thereabouts, and this number changes on an hourly basis, killed by Israeli airstrikes in Gaza, many of whom are unfortunately children and innocent civilians, of course. And the amount of humanitarian aid that has gone into the Strip has been woefully inadequate. It's a trickle, a drop in the ocean, according to many of the humanitarian agencies. Many of the hospitals have stopped working, either because of the bombardments or because of a lack of fuel and electricity. And so healthcare services in Gaza are pretty much on the verge of collapse, and that is if they haven't already collapsed. Militarily, operationally, we've seen Israel conduct limited ground operations in certain parts of Gaza. Some of these seem to have been repelled by Hamas, others may not have been. Yet there isn't yet the full-scale ground assault that Israel had been talking about. And there are several explanations that you've just mentioned in your introduction as to why that might be the case.
Right. The U.S. has also attacked facilities in Syria linked to Iran, but it claims that the strikes were not linked to the Israel-Hamas war. What do you make of that? And will this move lead to a further escalation in tensions in the region?
There has already been a ripple effect of the ongoing conflict between Hamas and Israel throughout the region. So we've seen attacks against U.S. forces and U.S. bases coming out of pro-Iranian militias in Yemen, the Houthis in Iraq and in Syria that have targeted U.S. bases in those countries and also U.S. assets in the Red Sea. In return, the Israelis have also conducted airstrikes against Syrian airports. There's a constant exchange of gunfire across the border with Lebanon. And there are increasing American airstrikes against assets in Syria. From the American perspective, this is, on the one hand, meant, and President Biden said this very clearly 2 days ago, to send a very clear signal to Iran that the U.S. will respond to further escalation. And the Iranians have also been very keen on sending a message that they are able to open up multiple fronts in this war. I think at the moment, none of the main actors, neither the United States nor Iran, would want this to spill over into a open confrontation, into a regional war. But the risk for miscalculation is, of course, always there. If we have a big strike by Hezbollah that kills many Israelis, or vice versa, then who knows? Hezbollah could get dragged into this conflict, so could the United States, and by extension, and in consequence, Iran.
Right, we're leaving it there for the moment. Thanks very much for being here on the broadcast and sharing those perspectives.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And with me on the broadcast this minute now is Khaled Barrell. He is the former director of National Security Council, with us direct from she is with us direct from Tel Aviv. Let me begin by asking you for the latest on the situation on the ground right now. Those reports of the heavy rocket firing towards Tel Aviv over the last 24 hours. Tell us more about the situation there right now.
Well, exactly as you said, there is indeed, there has been heavy rocket fire, not just to Tel Aviv, all over the center part of Israel and down south, very heavy rocket fire. Needless to say, the morning Tel Aviv was still pretty bustling, but as time elapsed and rockets started infiltrating, we had to stay home near shelters and shelter several times. It's quiet at the moment, but I don't assume it will continue to be quiet. The IDF, the Israeli Air Force, is currently attacking pretty heavily in Gaza, Hamas targets in the Gaza Strip. And so I assume at some point there will be some rocket fire in retaliation to that. That is now our reality.
What about the aid corridors and the humanitarian pauses that have been called as the urgent need of the hour to address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza? Aren't those a part of Israel's plan right now so that aid can reach the civilians in Gaza?
Yes, Israel has not rejected or opposed humanitarian corridors or humanitarian shelter area down south. As a matter of fact, Israel has encouraged the population, the civilian population, to move down south. As you may or may not know, Hamas is trying very hard to prevent a lot of the civilians from leaving, taking away car keys, taking away IDs, sometimes physical violence, because, of course, Hamas uses the civilian population of Gaza as a human shield. And Hamas's gravest concerns is that if civilians are indeed out of the way, it will be more easily targeted. And I don't know if you're aware of the very elaborate evidence that the IDF spokesperson put out today about Hamas command and control centers being based under the Shifa hospital, which is very central in the Gaza Strip.
Let me just ask you this, since you mentioned that. You talk about how Israel is not against aid reaching the Gaza Strip. You talk about how Israel wants to protect the Gaza civilians, but at the same time, we have reports of safe zones being targeted. There is no safe place, as several reports have pointed out. Why is that? What is Israel trying to prove to that?
No, I disagree with that characterization completely. I don't think that safe zones are being targeted. There are plenty of targets available inside the Gaza Strip without trying to or needing to target any civilian humanitarian corridors or areas that have been allotted to it. This is just part of the ongoing attempt to prevent Israel from retaliating against Hamas targets. It's the same part of what I said. It's the part of what I said before, which is the same as not letting the civilians leave because they need it as human shields. So again, just from a military standpoint, let alone a moral standpoint as well, Israel does not target humanitarian areas designated or anything of that sort. Certainly, it is not pleasant in Gaza. It is not pleasant at the moment in those humanitarian corridors.
I have to interrupt. There is a very mild statement to describe the scenes that we have been getting in the reports that have been put out by international bodies. These are not just.
I don't disagree with you. I'm saying it is certainly not a good situation there.
There's no situation in Gaza.
No, I'm not. No, listen, I'm not pretending to say, oh, everything is fine in Gaza. On the contrary, I'm agreeing with you. I'm saying Gazans, civilians are now paying a very steep price for the massacre and the atrocities that Hamas inflicted on Israel on October 7th. I absolutely agree with that characterization. That is what's going on. That is what Hamas always does. What Hamas wants to do, because the pain of the civilians in Gaza serves them. This isn't news. This is the Hamas modus operandi. This isn't new.
Right. In Jordan, there are thousands of people who have been taking to the streets. The anger there is only palpable. They basically want the annulment of the peace treaty with Israel. How do you respond to that and the demand that's been coming in overall?
I believe that any attempt to meddle with peace agreements between Israel and Jordan, Israel and Egypt, and et cetera, are obviously counterproductive to all countries involved. I don't imagine for a second that that would promote peace, calm, or quiet in the region. However, at the same time, you're asking me these questions about humanitarian situation in Gaza. I will remind you that both Jordan and Egypt are refusing to take any Palestinians into their countries. So at the same time that we are looking at the Palestinian rage in Jordan and at the concern for Gazans, we have to remember the number one enemy of the Gazan civilians is Hamas. And to the extent that Jordan and Egypt want to help the Gazan civilians, they have to keep that in mind. And again, I am not Jordanian or Egyptian, but let's remind everybody they are not taking any refugees in.
Indeed, and that has led to fresh concerns over what happens to these demands and what happens to those who have been trying to ask for a solution as far as the humanitarian crisis is concerned. We are leaving it there for the moment. Thanks very much for joining us on the broadcast.
Just before we leave, I would like to say one word. It's very fine and well, and I understand the need to talk about the humanitarian concerns in Gaza, but I will not leave any interview without reminding you that there are over 200 people who have been abducted by Hamas, held as hostages, including children, women, and babies and elderly. And we don't know anything about those. And certainly there's no humanitarian assistance for them. So let's keep that in mind as well.
Do we see the ground offensive happening over the next few hours at this point?
That's not an answer. That's not an answer I can give you. That's not something that I know or would disclose. I do hope that we are able to reach some sort of situation where the hostages are first brought back, civilians abducted by their homes after witnessing and experiencing terrible atrocities. And we're still waiting to see where that goes. But once again, that will not detract from what is coming with regard to Hamas.
Hamas has also said at the same time that 50 hostages have been killed by Israeli airstrikes. How do you react to that statement?
I react to saying that Hamas has also said that 500 to 750 people were killed in a hospital that Israel bombed. What really happened was a much lower number killed by jihad, Islamic Jihad, Hamas partners, but firing from the vicinity of a hospital. So Hamas said to me is not something I rely on whatsoever.
What about the reports from the UN and what the UN has been saying about the plight of the Gazans and the need for the aid to come in?
First of all, we allowed aid to come in. What we're not allowing to go in is fuel, which fuels the Hamas mechanisms and especially their subterranean headquarters and war operating machine. Second, I would address that by saying the UN has to take a good look at how it's treating atrocity inflicted on Israelis and Jewish people, because there is not a word about that in the way the UN addressed it. So at this point, very disillusioned with the UN. Israel acts in the most humanitarian way possible at a time of war, not because of the UN, because of morality and because of values and because we are not a terrorist organization.
Right. We are leaving it there for the moment. Thanks very much for being here.
Thank you.
WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the updates on the move.